Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jack McCullough. I am the president of the CFO Leadership Council, and I want to thank you all for joining us today. It's going to be a great program. So before I get into it, I want to cover a few administrative things. First of all, your lines are muted. That is by design. We'd like to open them up, but there's always one person that makes a bunch of noise in the background and ruins it for the rest of us. So everybody except me and the panelists will have muted lines today. If you do have any questions, you will see a chat box on the right-hand side of your monitor. Ask them there. I will check periodically, and I will ask on your behalf. Another thing, we do offer CPE for our members, and to prove that you were actually paying attention to the program, we will have 4 polling questions throughout the event. So I will call your attention to them. You'll have about 30 seconds to a minute to answer them. They'll be relatively easy polling questions. And you need to answer all 4 to get CPE. If you have trouble with answering the questions, for some reason there are certain operating systems that don't work well with this software. So what you can do is, while you're actually completing the poll, take it out of Screen Max, minimize your screen and answer the poll, and then come back. That just seems to solve most of the problems. And then I want to give you a little background on what we're doing today and how we got here. First of all, my friend Lynn Blake was actually she was one of the founding members of the Minneapolis chapter of the CFO Leadership Council. And she told me of what a great consulting firm she's working for and about this laser methodology they developed. And I said, that's something that's invaluable to our members. I sort of joke that, going through a pandemic like this, we're sort of figuring this thing out as we go. The CFOs and controllers who were alive during the Spanish flu probably aren't available to help us very much. So we're doing this on our own. And it seems like you guys came up with a great methodology. So we're going to share that with you today. So with that in mind, Rick, who is the founder and CEO of Growth Operators, is going to give you a brief presentation on the laser methodology. And he founded the company for a simple reason: to help his clients achieve their maximum potential. I think you're going to find this framework really interesting. Because of what I do for a living, I see a lot of these, and this one's particularly impressive. And what I like about it is it's very, very pragmatic. So Rick, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Jack. Appreciate the opportunity to share our framework, and thanks for hosting today. Laser is a framework that we developed here at Growth Operators to help companies focus on managing their business through the pandemic, which is impacting all businesses in varying ways. But it's really a methodology that encourages companies to really never stop planning, if you will. And former President Eisenhower had a great quote from his military days, and that quote is that in preparing for battle, I have always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. And that says a lot, especially in light of what we all experience. I would imagine most of the attendees today are CFOs and spent a great deal of time last fall and into the early winter getting budgets ready for 2020. And all of us face the same thing in mid-March, when the world that we built those plans for completely changed on us. And so it really highlights a situation where the planning itself becomes very important, but the plan that was put together becomes largely irrelevant. And so we developed LASER, which is an acronym that stands for 5 different focus areas. One being getting liquidity first. Second is adapting your strategic plan and forecast to the new reality. Third is focusing on a period of time where businesses need to survive the near term in light of the challenges that many or most businesses face. The next step being the emerge period, at which time we go from the hunker down mode into getting back to the new normal mode, and with the new normal mode ultimately culminating in the renew phase. And so that's really a kind of an overview of LASER. I'm going to unpack it a bit. What you see on the right-hand side of the screen here is the canvas. We have a mantra here at Growth Operators. It's always going to be hard to execute on anything you choose to, but let's not overcomplicate it. And so the canvas itself is one page that stands in front of a great deal of detail that stands behind it. But our philosophy is let's get as much as we can of the essence of what we're trying to do on one page. And so the laser canvas really shows the various steps of going through the laser process. The first of which is the L phase, or maintaining sufficient liquidity. And so a lot of companies have a 13-week cash flow forecast representing really one quarter's worth of cash inflows and outflows. And that's really what we had encouraged companies to focus on and start with, is really looking out in detail at the next quarter, taking a conservative view, maybe varying scenarios based on, towards conservative or bias towards conservatism on what does cash look like over the next 13 weeks, and also considering that both on a mitigated basis and an unmitigated basis. Unmitigated meaning, you're not going to pull certain levers. Mitigated being, perhaps I could stretch my vendors out a bit or not. And really the key there is, looking at your covenant compliance forecasts, keeping different options open, making sure that you don't realize that you're running out of cash the week before you run out of cash, giving yourself sufficient time to doing something about it. And really, after going through that exercise, we've encouraged clients to keep a key performance indicator dashboard really focused on more survival and liquidity metrics. The analogy that we use is, if you've suffered a trauma, much like businesses suffered a trauma due to this crisis, if you're in the ER, they're monitoring vital signs. If you're going through physical therapy, recovering from something, they're monitoring very different things. And we really encourage businesses to say, focus on a KPI dashboard with these key survival metrics, cash on hand, weeks cash on hand, et cetera. The next phase of the laser framework that we developed is the adapt phase. And that's really where, to my point earlier, really adapting the strategic plan to the new reality. And we wanted to emphasize with our clients that because there's so much uncertainty, investing as much time or anywhere near as much time in that as you did in planning in the fall is really not the idea. The idea is to invest enough time so it's beneficial, but realizing that you may have to go through this exercise again in a month, maybe weeks. And so really looking at things that you probably do a lot of, looking at a SWOT analysis and looking at it from a smart SWOT perspective. And, what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and how can I, leverage the strengths and the opportunities and mitigate the weaknesses and threats, particular to this environment. Another thing we encourage clients to look at is their go-to-market plan. We like the ANZOFS matrix, which is a 2x2 product or service, if you will, if you're a services company, market grid. And there's really looking at it from the standpoint of your existing products or services as they may relate to your existing markets or customers, and just how the crisis may have changed your customers' needs and preferences, where you can look at further market penetration on certain of the products you already have with certain of the customers you already have because of this. And then also looking at market development, which is taking your existing products into new markets that might have come to bear because of this. Product development, developing new products or services for your existing markets. And then diversification, which, given that we're in a crisis, there aren't a lot of companies looking to diversify necessarily, but really particularly those first three areas, thinking through how this crisis could put you in a position to take advantage of those. And then out of that exercise, that rapid strategic replanning exercise, really putting together a set of initiatives, developing your survival initiatives for the near-term time horizon, your emerge initiatives for that point in time that none of us know exactly when it's going to be, but we do know that this too will end and we'll be emerging and really thinking forward, and then thinking of renewal initiatives. And then from all those initiatives, reforecasting 2020, and then preparing an extension of that initial 13-week cash flow forecast to really take it out 6 months to 26 weeks, as best you can, to give you as much of a lead time in looking at whether or not there's going to be liquidity pressures or not on your business. The survive phase, I think, is, as you all would suspect, really the survival phase is very much about preserving cash, cost containment, preserve your critical strengths, your differentiators, try to make sure you're not throwing out your ability to or leaving yourself without the ability to emerge rapidly. And I, one of the key points here was that we really encourage clients to say it's not 100% defensive during this time. Make sure you're probably focusing 80% of your time on the defensive view, but remember that this will end. And so, and most of our competitors, if not all, are probably in the same boat as we are, in that they're all at a standstill as well. And so, to the extent we can take 20% of our focus and have it forward-looking, if we can get out of the gates faster, when we get into that emerge phase, we may be able to take market share from competitors, which again leads us to that emerge time period where, planning for that time period. I think the key here is none of us know exactly when survival ends and emerging starts, and when emerging ends and when renewal starts. But keep it in mind, again, it's not the plan, it's the planning that is really the value add in this whole process. And so really reassessing and shoring up liquidity, continuing to focus on those defensive measures, but realizing we're emerging and seeing if we can use that time to our advantage from the 20% of our time and effort that we spend in that survival phase, really focusing on that offense. And then onto the R, which is the R in laser, which is renew. And this is the point in time where, to the extent that we're diligent and successful in getting to this point, now it's time to rev the engines back up to full speed and execute on the renew initiatives. Focusing on, do I have liquidity needs now that are more growth related rather than survival and emergence related, and accelerating the go-to-market efforts, bringing the team back to full strength, and so on and so forth. So the idea of laser for us was not so much to be extremely prescriptive, but it was to provide a framework. Again, that framework is, as Eisenhower would say, it's not the plan, it's the planning, and providing that framework really for, to facilitate that sort of ongoing dialogue, because great companies face challenges and adversities like this all the time. We've all faced them, and having some sort of a structure, some sort of a methodology behind focusing our efforts on what we can do, rather than on how unfortunate the situation may be. That's what gets us out of these things. So.
Hey, Rick, let me just interrupt you. I want to call attention to the audience that the first polling question is up. The question is, what part of laser best describes where your company is today? So forgive me.
That's great. And I think it's a great segue into, this is one framework of, I'm sure many that a lot of people have heard of and have seen, but if it is helpful, feel free to reach out. We're happy to share copies of the canvas and and any insights. But so thanks much, Jack. I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, no problem. Great. Well, I want to bring the panelists in, and they have a few things in common, not the least of which is that they all have fantastic financial minds. But Alyssa is working for one of the real rapid growing Silicon Valley startups, and Susan and Lynn are working for consulting type firms that focus on helping their clients grow. So I think there's probably going to be a growth theme here throughout this conversation. We'll go one at a time, and I guess we'll just go first way, it's alphabetical by first name, which means you're first, Alyssa. But just a little bit of background, if you could share some of your planning insights and maybe react to the laser. But a little on Alyssa, she's the CFO at Clari. Is it Silicon Valley or San Francisco that you're located?
Silicon Valley. Yeah.
Great. So a Silicon Valley startup. And Clari's developed a revenue operations platform that uses AI and automation to help B2B organizations drive growth. So Alyssa, tell us a little about what you've been up to and any reactions you have.
Yeah, so I wish I would have had Rick's laser methodology in front of me around, say, March 12th or so. It was interesting what he was describing, how, we went through all of this planning process in the fall. I'll never forget the day because the shelter in place order in California was announced the day that we got our board meeting or our operating plan approved at our board meeting. And so the day we got it approved is the day that it was invalidated. And so it was a really challenging, stressful, rapid fire process that we went through immediately after that to rethink our plan for the year and come up with a strategy. And so in particular, I really, one thing that I think it's easy to do in times like this is to really get bogged down in the present and focused on surviving the day to day or the month to month. One thing I love about the framework is the forward looking piece. And so not just being bogged down in what does my cash flow need to look like over the next quarter, but continuing to keep some part of the planning framework and a lens on making sure that you also have a strategy for the emerge and the renew process. So I think those are really fantastic elements of the framework and make it very strong. So thank you, Rick, for sharing.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, so Lynn is actually a CFO, and she is now doing consulting with growth operators herself. And so, Lynn, I know you've had an interesting transition being a more traditional CFO until relatively recently, and now you're working with a lot of firms as a consultant. What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, so thanks, Jack. You flashed the results to the polling question. I know we weren't going to belabor those, but I got a glimpse enough to sort of validate what I'm seeing from companies, the range of companies that I'm working with right now, which is that the bulk of them seem to be in those somewhere in those middle three stages between adapt, survive, and beginning to emerge, right? So that said, every sector and every company is its own case study with very different dynamics. And I've been involved in a lot of different situations, even since the pandemic started. So I will say it does seem like, well, first off, I would take travel and hospitality sectors as a carve out. I don't think that they're yet into survive, emerge, and renew. Other than that, I feel that most industries or most sectors have done a lot of the, liquidity and adapt first line of defense measures. So cutting costs, restructuring to the extent they feel they need to in the near term, reducing costs, reducing inventory levels, doubling down on AR and collections, working with their bankers to increase their working capital lines, get some flexibility on covenants if necessary, those types of things. So, it's nice to be sort of through that stage. I will caution not to be a kind of a Debbie Downer, but the laser framework, I don't think we can ever say we've gone from L, it'd be nice if we could just sequentially step through the phases. We don't know what's going to happen right now more than ever. So just from my various CFO experiences of the past, I would say you might find ourselves back in that liquidity need or that first stage sooner than you think for various reasons. So, don't forget about focusing on maintaining liquidity, maintaining, capital buffers, enough dry powder to get through the emerge and renew phase. Stay close to your bankers. One of my close banker friends quoted a thing that's on his desk, has been his whole career, which is cash is plentiful until it isn't. So that said, I feel like companies are, now thinking beyond that, beginning to adapt. Certainly the world of doing business has changed for every company, large or small. So the technology innovation, well, initially somewhat painful for all, more of a, those that were ahead of the curve there, made a more seamless transition. But harnessing those improvements, largely technology driven, but there's other process things, right, where companies have figured out what you can do more simply, what you can streamline, and what technology things have both economic and productivity savings. And looking ahead to say, what of those things do we want to preserve, and is it prudent to preserve even when things get more normal and we can be more face-to-face and have more traditional sales meetings and events like that? What should we be keeping in terms of some of these improvements? That's the silver lining in all this, is right, what can get us ahead into the future. And, normally a CFO is involved in that dialogue, and you think about, what technology and innovations to fund in next year's budget. But now more than ever, I think the CFO should be driving the discussion about what changes to the business have we had to make that we want to preserve and even further extend or invest in as we get into the emerge and renew phases.
Okay, terrific. That's great. And Susan Heinlein. So Susan is the founder of Elune Decision Lab, which is a financial analysis tool that helps business owners make data-driven decisions about pricing, products, customers, and investments. That must be invaluable right about now these days. So why don't you share with us, maybe what you're going through both as a business owner and what you're seeing with your clients. Oops, you might have muted yourself. I'm not sure.
I did. Thank you. Yeah, so I actually have I have two businesses. So I have the Elune Decision Hub, which is really focused on helping small businesses with financial decisions in a sort of an automated kind of way. And then I have a consulting firm that I focus on helping large companies accelerate their results really through strategy and organization. And Lynn, you said a lot of things that I think really resonated with what I'm seeing with different clients. And one of the things I've seen certainly coming up to this is really the difference in how small companies have had to react versus large companies. Sort of this whole liquidity question. Large companies have had, I think, a lot more. They have a lot more capital and ability to kind of hold through this time. And the small companies that I've been working with, have had to be much more nimble and quick and figure out their liquidity positions. I really like the LASER framework. I just came introduced to it. So I think it's a really logical way to walk through what you need to do. So certainly, I'm seeing most people seem to be kind of through the liquidity phase and are trying to figure out what to do. And I would say, as we think about this hopefulness part, I think it's the companies that figure out how are their services or products going to be relevant in the new normal is going to be really important. And I participate on some forums with some other women leaders, and it seems there's two camps of leaders. There's leaders who are kind of waiting for the new normal to come back, or waiting for things to get back to normal. And then there's the camp of people who kind of understand that, it's probably not going to come back. It's not going to come back exactly as it has been, sort of to what I heard Lynn talk about and what Alyssa said here too. And so the companies that are doing the best are the ones that are thinking about what is it going to look like when this is done. And that starts with really understanding your core and your mission and what you're really good at, and really thinking about what business are you in, right? And I'll share an example. I don't know if it's relevant do you want me to share that right now, Jack?
Sure,
yeah.
That sounds good.
Okay, so for example, and this is a story I heard, and stories are things that can be told again, but a business, they were in the school bus business. So they thought, oh, we're out of business. We bus school children. And the woman who owned it, was challenged really to think about, well, what business am I in? I'm in the transportation business. And, then how do I then use my assets and skills where there are different market needs? And, they were able to actually quickly pivot their business and not say, oh, we're going to wait till school comes back, to pivot it to going after different markets. So kind of that market quadrant that Rick talked about. And so I think that's going to be important, because I think everybody's business has changed. Your customers' businesses have changed. And how do you start laying out the choices? And the best place is going to be this intersection between what you're good at and how your customers' needs have changed, and finding that sweet spot for the, moving into emerge and renew.
That sounds great. Well, I have a group question, and I'll go. I'm going to start with Rick. And then Rick can go first, and then the rest of you can chime in. But so, Rick, if you can share some examples of how clients that you've been working with have been reacting to, the events of 2020. unlike anything we've seen, obviously. But have they changed their approach to strategic and operational planning? And, if you have some examples and stories, that would be great. And then the rest of you can jump in after.
Yeah, I've got a couple different examples, really, Jack, on opposite ends of the spectrum. But we have clients that have been hit very hard in a negative way. We also have clients of ours that have been hit very hard in an unexpectedly positive way. And I can give you examples of both. But what we have seen, regardless of which end of the spectrum those clients fall on, their approach to planning has changed quite a bit. And I think most of us as CFOs, strategists, et cetera, really one and the same, are used to planning in an environment that's much more predictable. And this is just anything but. And so, they're having to really adapt to, I guess for lack of a better term, agile planning philosophy, where, let's plan, but let's not plan too much because it may again be irrelevant tomorrow. But there, we have clients that are, you're having to look at not only your own plan, but you're having to consider your vendors and how does this impacting them? How is, if you're reliant on supply chain from your vendors, what's happening with their supply chains and the supply chains of the vendors that supply those vendors? And so it really becomes this very, iterative process of really thinking through. And then the companies that I think are doing, they're most successful at turning that into something that's actionable. It's really not a plan. It's more a series of maybe gated if-then statements. And, if this, then that. The other thing that is particularly helpful that all of us as CFOs can be helpful with, to that end, and figuring out, which way to toggle the if-then switch for those answers, is in really providing ready access to information, leading indicators, if you will. I mean, what's the data, that is coming into the business every day? What can we learn? What can our teams learn to help inform the business on, what I call a fast feedback loop? It's, if we are planning for this and expecting this, what can we be looking at to indicate if that's actually happening? So that's the kind of the, that's a lot of what we're seeing, Jack, is a much more kind of an ongoing fluid, never stop planning is probably the best way to put it.
Makes sense. There is a polling question up. I just want to call people's attention to that. And for those who don't have eyeballs on it, the question is, how much has COVID changed your strategic planning process? Completely, moderately, or little or no impact? So if you folks could take 30 to 45 seconds to answer that, and we will continue with our conversation. Alyssa, just for contrast, since, I know you work for one particular company, why don't you, share your insights on what you guys have gone through?
Yeah, definitely. So I think we're a venture-backed, high-growth technology company in the Silicon Valley, and so historically, our planning process had been very much with an eye on growth, making strategic investments to continue on a growth curve. And one way that we changed our planning process earlier this year was really what Rick described when he was going through the framework, and having much more of a bias towards conservatism. So we were very fortunate, earlier stage company, that we had done a fundraise in the fall. So we're in a very fortunate cash position. We weren't super concerned about runway, but we wanted to make sure that that last round that we raised really got us to our next milestones. And so while I would say historically we had built our models much more from a top line growth perspective, when we went through our replan process, we were much more focused on more of a, what is the worst case scenario look like from a top line perspective, and then we'll build our expense plan against that. If we overachieve on the top line, then we can add additional dollars to invest in additional areas. But I would say that the current environment really changed our focus of how we built out our plan, from being much more expense focused and focused on what could look like a worst case scenario on the top line, whereas before we were much more focused on growing the top line as quickly as possible.
Okay, cool. Lynn, you're working with several clients. Are you seeing anything different or similar?
Yeah, again, I would say it probably varies largely depending on the size of the company and, of course, public or private. So two or three clients I've worked with this year and during COVID are small, either just newly commercial stage or even pre-revenue companies. Companies like that, are more cash constrained. That's the downside. The upside is they have more process flexibility and may not even have process, right? So those companies, even amongst them, are in different sets of circumstances. I would say for the company I'm working with, primarily I'm raising capital, that became tougher. I think deal flow in general of all types came to almost a halt in mid-March, right? And then people were waiting for things to come back to normal. Then they realized they aren't going to, but during that time, trying to convert those fundraising and capital raising discussions with potential investors, getting them over the hump that, oh, we don't have to wait to meet face to face. We can do it this virtual way and keep the deal discussion going. And even, so for example, one of those is a telecom company, and the CEO has proprietary technology to make the phone call app on your phone that doesn't do much but answer the phone call, or you can decline it, relevant again by delivering content and other things in the call. So it's really unique technology. The next step is getting face-to-face with AT&T, which we've been in discussions with, but they want to demo the product. And it's much better to demo it literally in person with demo phones that the people are holding and things like that across the board. But I've told the CEO, we can't wait until, even if we're comfortable going there to demo, AT&T's office in Atlanta might not be comfortable having us. Like, we got to keep this discussion going and alive. And I think we're just at a point where the other side of the table is, willing to do that now. People are realizing, if for no other reason than they need to innovate. Investors need to have places to get return on capital. So I think the deal flow and deal discussions are happening again, which is inherent to kind of the plans, right, for those small companies. From a larger company perspective, it's a whole different, ball game. And most companies I know and have worked with are, calendar year fiscal companies are coming up on the planning process, and it's going to be even more challenging with 2020 not being a representative benchmark or baseline to start the planning process from. So for those companies, I think the CFO needs to drive the discussion about, those companies are going to have the annual plan, right? Public companies are likely still going to have to give guidance to the street. All companies are going to have to set annual measures for compensation plans and metrics. But should we step back and think about the objectives of the planning process differently, as well as the benchmarks? So I was just talking to a good friend of mine who's on several boards of both public and private companies, talking with him this morning about what he's seeing across his universe of companies he sits as a director for. And we talked about looking at your 19 results as a first proxy for a baseline, your FY20 forecast as it looks today, based on what we know. You got to come up with your best view, right? The CFO should have the best view, and look at the difference. For most companies, the miss is COVID driven, but then break that down and bifurcate it into things that are temporary, like even PPP funding, restructuring costs, etc., and things that maybe are permanent. Most probably aren't permanent, but loss of a big customer, something like that, could be permanent. And do that walk forward from both those views and see what that looks like in terms of setting the baseline for your financial plan going into 2021. So thinking about it very high level in a sort of a walk forward way, things that are, permanent changes, temporary changes, things you want to invest in based on our learnings from this downturn, and maybe technology and innovation versus other things. And factoring those into the strategic planning discussion now, not waiting and not thinking that really the planning process is just, on August 30th, we send out the planning memo, and on September 15th, we issue the calendar, and then we do the templates of the 9 months actual plus 3 months forecast. You know, at some point you have to get tactical with your budget process, but that's much less important than the forward-looking macro level discussion about big changes and metrics that, you know, and how to look at that as we come out of COVID.
Cool. Susan, anything to add? They've been pretty thorough, but I know you've got some great insights as well.
Yeah, I think there's a lot good. I think I would focus sort of on the thoughts around this agile planning process, which kind of requires it to be tops down. And I would build upon the walk forward, you know, really being much more assumption based with multiple scenarios. You know, I like the idea of planning for the conservative, and then if it's upside, it's great. But I think having, you know, becoming much more agile and assumption based, so less of this bottoms up kind of approach and more of, you know, what's the worst case, what's the best case, you know, what are some in between case, what are those assumptions, and then start monitoring those assumptions so you can see, you know, which plan evolve. I think the other thing is, because now everyone has gone through a change, I think that initiatives that were harder to maybe get funded in the past or to get time invested in, people now might be more open to. So I think a lot of things around driving scale and process improvement and building scale for growth, especially in your finance, HR, IT functions, you know, there's the opportunity to start thinking about how do you know, kind of stay flat, keep expenses flat as you figure out what's going to happen with the growth curve. You know, stop talking about the zero-based budgeting. You actually have to do it now.
Yeah, it's no longer just a concept from the 1970s. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
So cool. Indeed. I'd love to stick with you, Susan, for the next question. So, because you do work with large and small clients. So, in business that have been the hardest hit, what ways can companies think about transforming their entire business model?
Yeah, so there's some other canvases out there you guys might be aware of them, like Lean Startup Canvas, et cetera. And you know, some of the small companies, I would say, you know, a good portion of them were probably going to go out of business. And I've seen some either transform or go out of business. And again, it gets back to thinking about what is your core. And so if you're in a market where, like the school bus market, where I was saying, you know, nobody's going on a school bus right now. Well, we'll see what happens here, but they weren't. Another one, I have a colleague who's in the transportation or in the trade show business. So she is building trade show exhibits. Well, there aren't any trade shows, so her revenue is basically gone away. So the concept, there's the dog. So the concept is thinking about, well, what actually is she good at, and what is her company good at, and so what hasn't changed is her customers still need to communicate their brand. They still need to, you know, they want to be able to still grow. So the customer she was working with, so, you know, she's thinking about, does she become a customer experience expert? That's what she knows. She knows how to make the customer experience come alive at the trade show, right? But the trade show isn't here anymore. So that doesn't mean that her customers don't want to have their customers to have a brand experience. How does she start reinventing herself around delivering on that? And maybe she can reinvent that industry if meetings aren't going to come back. And so I think it's the ones that pivot early and that kind of throw off the blinders of what business they're in and figure out what they're really good at. And I suggest people do that with their teams, and the CFO can lead that and kind of go back to your mission. Like, what is it that we are the best at? And can we redefine our markets and who our customers are?
Sounds good. I just want to give kudos. You handled the dog distraction really well. I jumped out of my seat. So I actually was presenting, and if there's any people from the Detroit chapter on, they can verify this. But I was actually presenting probably about 2 years ago at a dog-friendly restaurant. I didn't even know such a thing existed in the real world, but we were in this room. It was sort of a private room, but the wall was open, so you could look down on what was going on in the bar below. And a dog fight broke out in the middle of my presentation.
Oh wow!
It just threw off my entire rhythm. You handled it well. Anyway, Rick, as either you or I are the grand old man of the group, so we have some accumulated wisdom. And you were CFO in 2008, the last time that we faced a recession.
Yes,
And it wasn't quite up to what we're facing, but it's what people know. So what did you learn during that can be applied today?
Yeah. Thanks for dating me, Jack. No, I learned a lot. I'm sure, those of us probably, assuming that there are others that are, that are watching or listening, that probably were in CFO roles during that crisis as well.
Well, Alyssa was probably in high school, so. Sorry, I want to interrupt again.
Do an HR forum.
So the thing that really jumps out at me, for my key takeaway from that one, Jack, was it's over communicate with your lender. And just a little bit of context, I was actually back in 2008 when the last crisis hit in September of 2008. I was the CFO of a consumer products company. So our customers were large retailers like Best Buy, Target, Walmart. And for the record, September is the worst time for a crisis to hit if you're a consumer products company, because for us, all of our products were manufactured in China, and we had 180-day lead times. And so we really had to lock down our demand plans and place our orders with the manufacturers in June, July at the latest. And so by September, literally boats full of product were on the water headed our way. And in September, it's the nature of supplying large retailers. You really don't get firm purchase orders from those retailers until they actually need the product. And so we were just in a situation where we knew we had a lot more product coming our way than Best Buy, Target. All of our customers were ultimately going to order just because they were going to cut back their order volumes accordingly. So there was nothing we could do about it other than get on the phone with the lender immediately and just, start the process of informing. And, being September, we had quarterly covenants, and I advised, our lender, our bank, that September covenants were going to be fine, but I was virtually certain, hadn't yet done the math, but was, that was going to be the next thing I was going to do, is start to forecast what December covenants would look like. But I let them know in advance. They weren't going to look they weren't going to look anything resembling good. So, but what that process does really is, you have to understand that lenders aren't incentivized to say no. It's the credit officers at the lenders that are the ones that have to, make the tough decisions. But, the better you as a CFO can prepare, the person you're dealing with at the lender, to let them know how you and the management team are going to face the brutal facts of your reality and still pay the bank back. That's what they want to hear. And so it's that over communication that I found, during that crisis, that, for us, we were, we were at the high water mark on borrowings on our credit facility. And, there was, nothing pretty about it, but, we ultimately made good on everything. We did not get put into workout in a situation where by rights we probably should have. But I think it had to do with just that over communication. And not all the news we communicated was good by any stretch, but I think they just appreciated being informed.
Yeah, that's great. There was a study years ago where they asked bankers what their biggest problem with the clients were, and they asked the clients what the biggest problem they had with their banks. And the banks said that the clients didn't communicate with them. And the client said the bank showed no interest in learning about their business. And it's like, I'm not the smartest guy, but I think I can solve this for everybody if I try. Sounds like you figured it out. So, Alyssa, I want to ask you, because when we spoke earlier, I know you leverage data quite a bit during your planning process. And can you share a little about how that might have changed and, based upon your analysis, some of the fundamental changes you might have been forced to make?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are an enterprise software as a service company. And so one of the big pieces of data that we leverage when we're building our operating plan is pipeline build. So we look at our pipeline metrics, and then we also look at our conversion metrics. And so one thing that was really challenging when we went through the replan process is We may still be able to leverage our pipeline build data to help inform the plan, but a lot of the data around the way that deals would move through the funnel, so all of our conversion metrics, were basically invalidated because deals were taking much longer to move through the stages or cycles. Companies were tightening their budgets dramatically, so what would have historically been a 3-month sales cycle now could be a 9-month sales cycle. And in the early days of our planning, we didn't, the historical conversion data was not reliable to build our forward-looking plan. And so we had to adapt really quickly because we couldn't rely on the data that we had in order to do our projections. We're thankfully able to leverage our own platform. So one of the core capabilities of Clari is has an artificial intelligence component to predict conversion rates and deal health. So we leveraged our own platform there. But even the artificial intelligence takes time to learn. So we went through that process of relearning what those conversion rates and sales cycles would look like. I think Susan mentioned you have to continue to evolve your plan as you go through the cycle, and as you're building your scenario plans, continue to evolve as you get more data. So obviously, as we've gotten further along in the cycle, we're now able to leverage a lot more of the data that we have, and it's becoming more predictable again, though not as predictable as it was several quarters back. So that's a big way that the way that we leverage data had changed. I would say another point on that topic is I found personally that I've had to leverage that I've wanted to leverage my network in a lot bigger way. So there are a lot more phone calls, conversations with our board of directors, understanding what does the rest of your portfolio look like? What other things are you seeing? Companies might have more leading indicators than us that may have smaller, more repeatable deal sizes, for example, so they could see budgets freeing up earlier than we might. And so I would just say leveraging a lot more communication, direct one-on-one communication, understanding what other companies are going through. So talking to CFO peer networks, consultants and advisors like the folks on this call. It's always great to see what they're seeing with their clients and other companies, because when you're one individual in a company, you don't have all of those other data points. And so with a lack of predictable data, I relied a lot more on my network than I had previously when we were able to leverage our data in a much more predictable way.
Good, thanks, that's great. Polling question. So I will read it out loud again for those who can't see it. But based upon what you know today, where do you think your firm's headcount will be 1 year from now? And the options are higher than today, about the same as today, or lower than today. So if you can do that over the next minute or so, I have a question for Lynn. And Lynn, Labor Day is just around the corner. And I know that's when a lot of people start to think about the strategic planning process. So, what do you see as the challenges for strategic planning in light of COVID and some of the other things that are going on in society? Anything in particular that people should be thinking about?
Well, Jack, I touched on some of them earlier. I think, your starting point is typically the current year's projection and then building from there. So that's probably not the right starting point for any company. So thinking about what that correct baseline is to start building the plan from, and what assumptions, to Susan's point, are embedded in that are really important. Probably having an early dialogue with the right constituents. So CEO, board, leadership team, or 2 separate meetings, what have you, kind of getting a meeting of the minds on the approach to the budget, the philosophy, and the internal and external expectations. Certainly external, you're a public company, but having that early discussion about assumptions and drivers and benchmarks, and also what other things are going to be fed by the process. So it's typically compensation, variable compensation planning, is right there hand in hand with your financial plan. And I think it's important to address that up front as well. From compensation experts I know and heads of comp committees, the general philosophy, and certainly from like the comp consultants as well, is, cut within the grooves you already have. So don't just throw up your hands and say we need a new comp plan or put a new comp plan in place just for 1 year because of COVID, or cut the comp plan, but think about how to work within your existing framework. It's a lot of work to change plans. So I think for both the financial and the comp planning, work within your existing framework, but maybe for targets, for example, on financial measures, for at least for compensation, widen the min-max that pays out. So there's maybe more upside, more likelihood of people getting some participation in variable compensation next year, even if it's at a low level, and more upside for them to overdrive the targets. So that's a common theme I'm hearing in comp planning. In terms of the financial metrics, I think Susan's comment was interesting, that about half the people in her network are waiting to see what the new normal is going to be like, and the other half are trying to be more strategic or drive it. I think the CFO, every company, the new normal is the catchphrase, right, for post-COVID-19, but that's going to be different for every company, every industry, every CFO. So the CFO has to put a stake in the ground and say, I don't know what 2021 is going to look like, but here's what I've thought about using as the baseline for the financial metrics. Here's the components of it. Here's my sort of logic behind that. Again, fairly high level, but assumption-based, business drivers, what's changed, what's going to continue to change, and what the add backs are. And then knowing that 1/1/21, it doesn't all get back to normal, no matter what that new normal is. So I personally would say, and I'm kind of talking in the paradigm of calendar year companies, but 2021 plan that the first half there's going to be a COVID drag. I put it as a new line on my 7 or 9 element P&L, and I'd plan it for 6 months. I don't know what that number is. You got to think about, again, the CFO is going to, I tend to like to be conservative, so I might put a bigger number in there, and it's hard to measure against that line, right? Because can't hold that COVID drag variable constant, but it gives you some context to talk about a continuing impact. And then I think most people are optimistic enough to think that by third quarter of 2021 and beyond, hopefully things are more, if it isn't normal, it's your new normal for your business that you've kind of moved past. If there's a whole other wave and a year from now looks like this, then you're going to replan anyway. So personally, some of the CFOs I've talked to, I've helped them think about it that way. If I was going to have to start a plan process and present financial metrics for next year, that might be how I would think about it.
Okay, that's great. I just want to remind folks, and we're about 5 minutes before the scheduled end, although I think we started 2 or 3 minutes late. So, but if you do have any questions, you can type them in the chat box. I did get texted a question, and I don't actually recognize the phone number, but it's 617, so it's probably one of my members. They asked me to stop drinking. They found it very distracting when I do this, apparently. So I wasn't aware I was doing it that often. So anyway, there are no questions in the chat. So why don't we do a group question if we can? Oops, sorry about that. So what is some non-financial information that you can find useful as a leading indicator in doing your business planning during this crisis? And Susan, I don't think we started with you, so why don't you lead off? You might be muted again, I'm not sure.
You're muted.
You're muted. Can you hear us?
I can hear you.
That's what you get for being a good neighbor.
In fact, I think it's always good to start with non-financial information. The way I like to think about, revenue is an output. And, so if you think about top line and bottom line growth in the financial statements, they're outputs. So I think to this extent, you can help your business leaders think about what are the drivers, what are the things that you can control, the inputs. And so I almost think about planning almost always has to start with the inputs and the external non-financial information, and then you translate them into the financial information. So this could be market growth drivers, these could be lead generation. In fact, the way I like to think about it is kind of think about, what are the different core processes that make your company run, and what are the things that they're responsible for. So speed to market, new products, sales velocity, pipeline management, certainly expense management. But really, I think starting with the non-financial is actually the way to go, and then translate them into the financial statements.
Okay, that's great. Alyssa, you want to chime in?
Sure. I think Susan covered a lot of the non-financial metrics that or inputs that we're looking at as well. But one that came to mind for me for sustaining our business and thinking about the next phases. So the renew phase, we've kind of adopted a mentality and a framing of how do we accelerate around the curve. So it's very similar to the thought process of the framework, just a different way to articulate it. But one thing we've been paying a lot of attention to is employee sentiment. And I think that's really core to businesses right now. I think we're trying to gauge the employee satisfaction of our team. We think it's really critical to retain our top talent, to continue to hold on to our top and key employees. And so I think there's a lot of implications of that to the operating plan as well. So thinking about things like Lynn was talking a lot about different compensation methodologies, for example. Well, for a company like ours, that's our largest single line item in our financial statements. And so I think having a focus on employee sentiment, are you able to retain your best sales employees that will then take, if you're not able to retain them, a huge impact on your business to ramp hire new sales employees. So I think there's a big bucket of non-financial input coming from your employee sentiment that's core to your planning process, especially right now.
Great. Okay, we're going to ask a final polling question, and just a simple yes or no. Did you or did you not receive PPP funding this year? And if you want to take a little time with that, but why don't we continue with that question? And I think, Rick, you haven't answered. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct, Jack. I guess, one thing that I have been watching is data on COVID itself. And I think, rather than watching the number of new cases, I've been watching, more the death toll itself, and because I think that's really I think that's really the driver of the reality of what we're facing here. Fear tends to linger long beyond the reason for the fear. So I would say, the COVID data itself is going to be a leading indicator of how people are going to behave. But someone in particular I've been paying attention to is a gentleman by the name of Michael Levitt. He's a professor at Stanford. He's also a Nobel laureate. So he's got a few reasons to believe that he knows what he's talking about. But he's been looking at actually statistically the number of excess deaths over what would be normal for this time of year. It's really, rather than looking at what's coming out reported in terms of deaths that are COVID related, he's taken a look at how many deaths are there in the U.S. compared to the baseline, and it's actually getting to a point right now, according to his analysis and the data coming out of the CDC, where those numbers are really converging. So that could change again, but it's those types of things. This is a very, very frightening. This is a very, very frightening thing, but we do know it's going to end. And then, at the point where the disease is actually under control, human behavior would indicate that the fear will linger, and consumer behavior, customer behavior, whatever the case may be, we're all the revenues come from some human being made, or some decision made by a human being in some way, shape, or form. But I think looking at those types of things, that would be my, recommendation in terms of, when do you think the emerge phase kicks in? When do you think the renewal phase kicks in? It's really when, from a pandemic standpoint, things are, quantitatively getting back a little more along the lines of what normal is, at least from a mortality standpoint. So that's what I've been looking at.
Okay, cool. Lynn, why don't you share some insights, if you would?
I don't have too much to add. I think Susan's point about the non-financial data always should be driving the planning process. So again, it depends on the client and what their critical objectives towards their growth plan is. I have, a client that has an R&D dashboard they're constantly tracking against and showing to the board, an intellectual property dashboard that has key milestones on it that they're showing to, management obviously and the board, but really important measures for the stage of their company. And, now more than ever, you got to be looking at those things and also planning for different scenarios around assumptions, on hitting those business milestones. Certainly looking at the pipeline, what's in your pipeline, your customer retention, your kind of business development deal flow for a consulting company, all those things are more important than ever. And then just building on Alyssa's comment on the kind of CHRO side of the house, that's really important for the whole company, the whole enterprise. And from what I'm seeing on that dimension, the focus is on safety and the new normal and the COVID workplace plan and signing policies related to it and making sure that employees are safe and safety first. But about the Maslow's hierarchy and the bottom level being safety and security, you think about those kind of together, they're really different from an employee standpoint. So safety is one thing. Of course, we don't want our employees to get sick and we're going to develop protocols and we're going to file plans. But how do they feel secure in their job, and beyond that, engaged? And virtual, everything we're dealing with now, it's more important than ever. The cost of turnover for all our functions is always high. And I don't think it's going to get lower in, even though there's more people out there looking for jobs, the quality and the time and money spent recruiting is a big opportunity cost. So focusing on that element I'm really glad that Alyssa brought that up.
Yeah.
Okay. That's fantastic. I don't think I've heard anyone use Maslow's hierarchy since I was in graduate school. So that was a throwback for me. So it turns out we're actually at the end of our presentation. Boy, it zipped by, didn't it? Rick, I did get some requests for your presentation. So I don't know if you want to bring this. There was a screen with your contact info, or you can just tell people they can email you. Because of privacy laws in California and Massachusetts, I can't share our attendees' contact information with any of you, but I will put you in touch with anyone that you want to talk to. But Rick, you want them to email you? Is that the idea?
Sure. I will show my screen yet again here.
Okay, great.
And I'm not sure if there's a way to get that my contact information out to the attendees. I have been seeing some emails coming in, so we'll absolutely respond to those and get these out. But it's rick.nordbold, Nordbold, @growthoperators.com is my email address. You can also reach us through our website at growthoperators.com. Click on the contact us button and you can submit a request just through our info@growthoperators.com email address as well, and we'll go ahead and make sure to get you your own copy of the canvas, the laser canvas, and hopefully it's helpful in helping you think through the replanning, I guess the never stop planning process, for lack of a term.
Yeah, it never ends. Well, great. Thank you for making this available. So, team, I do want to thank you for your time. I think this was a great conversation. I'm sure our attendees learned quite a bit from your candor and your sharing of your expertise. So thanks very much, and I hope all of you have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, Jack.
Thanks, Jack.
Thank you very much.
Alrighty, I think, oops.